Greetings and welcome back to Junior English, and we are now in Unit 4 of our MyPerspectives volume. I'm with you on page 400 and following. I want to begin with this essential question: what is the relationship between literature and place? Read it with me now on page 400. As you read these selections, work with your whole class to explore the meaning and importance of the concept of place from text to topic. For Mark Twain, the majestic Mississippi River was a spiritual home that inspired his youthful daydreams of becoming a steamboat pilot. His writing celebrates the river's boats and bustling port towns and the ambitions of all who were shaped by this busy place that linked America's east and west. For Sarah Owen Jowett, the Maine woods became the place where a lonely young girl learns what is most valuable to her. As you read, consider what the selections show about the importance of a sense of place in both literature and the lives of real-life Americans. I'd like you to take a look at the strategies at the bottom of page 400. Of course, there's your list of readings on page 401. Let's turn now to the Historical Perspectives focus period, 1880 to 1920 of Unit 4. And do note the timeline at the bottom of these pages. I'm with you now on page 402. Notice, first of all, the three quotes that are provided there. Go ahead and read those and annotate those. And now let's turn to the history of the period itself. The headings. The frontier disappears. Even as pioneers moved to the west, the vast plains at the center of the nation remained a frontier with huge unsettled tracts of land. By 1890, however, due in large part to the explosion of railroads carrying Americans across the continent, the Census Bureau declared the frontier officially gone. Replacing the open range were farms and small towns, plowed fields, grazing lands, and miles of fences. By 1900, what once had been frontier land had become 14 new states. The next heading, tracks across the nation. At the start of the 20th century, almost 200,000 miles of train tracks crossed the continent, turning many small towns into cities. The federal government became involved, subsidizing railroad building and granting railroad companies western land to sell. As railroad networks increased and their wealthy owners grew in power, state governments and then the federal government tried to regulate the railroad monopolies. The federal government issued the Interstate Commerce Act of 1887, the first major government regulation of private business for the benefit of public interest. The next heading, in closing, Native Americans. As the frontier disappeared, the Native American peoples living there were displaced by settlements, by settlers, fences, and towns. These new settlements often interfered with the ways in which the Native Americans had lived for centuries. The cultures clashed, and the conflicts turned into battles, sometimes referred to as the Indian Wars. Against their will, whole Native American nations, totaling about 250,000 people, were moved to reservations, often far from their traditional homelands. By the way, pay attention to the graph on page 403 and study that closely as well, please. The Second Industrial Revolution will be our next heading. The introduction of electricity in the 1880s launched a second industrial revolution. Americans began to enjoy electric lights, telephones, automobiles, motion pictures, and skyscrapers. Urban populations exploded as millions of immigrants arrived and people moved away from rural areas, providing cheap labor. Low wages, child labor, and disease were the norm of the working class. Our next heading, the Gilded Age. Along with the growth of industry came the accumulation of enormous fortunes in the hands of a few quote-unquote robber barons, men such as banker John Pierpont Morgan, oil magnate John D. Rockefeller, and steel titan Andrew Carnegie. Author Mark Twain coined the term the Gilded Age, characterizing this era as having a golden and shiny surface that covered a base of corruption and greed. The energy of the nation led to change, however, as the power of monopolies inspired government regulations such as the Sherman Antitrust Act and political movements such as the Populist Party. On to page 404. The next heading, Rise of Jim Crow. Reconstruction was meant to rebuild the South after the Civil War. However, instead of freedom and opportunity, African Americans in the South soon faced a wall of systematically enforced discrimination that came to be known as Jim Crow laws. Poll taxes and other restrictions prevented African Americans from voting, while schools and other public facilities were strictly segregated, a situation reinforced by a Supreme Court ruling that declared separate but equal facilities legal. Our next heading, immigration or not. The new immigrants who arrived in America in the late 1880s came mainly from Southern and Eastern Europe. They flocked to New York, Chicago, and other major cities where they congregated with others from their homelands. In general, their crowded communities were marked by harsh conditions which some reformers sought to improve. At the same time, political bosses lobbied for immigrants' votes. A backlash of opinion grew because many native-born Americans felt threatened by the flood of cheap immigrant labor. By 1882, Congress began to pass legislation restricting the entrance of certain groups of immigrants, including a complete prohibition of immigrants from China. Our next heading, from farm to city. By 1900, 4 out of 10 Americans lived in urban environments. Inventions such as the elevator encouraged the building of skyscrapers, which made it possible for many more people to inhabit and work in the ever-growing metropolises of the East Coast and Midwest. Increasing urban density spawned slums where disease and poverty were rampant. Reformers, such as activist and Nobel Prize winner Jane Addams and photojournalist Jacob Riis, worked to improve living conditions for the poor. Our next heading, Workers Unite. After the Civil War, American workers began to form labor unions. The new unions led workers in strikes to protest low salaries and harsh working conditions. The history of these strikes was full of setbacks and advances and outbreaks of violence. Many strikes were suppressed by the government or by business owners who hire private security firms. Our next heading is American imperialism. As the 20th century approached, the United States was growing as a result of industrialization and expansion across the continent. Governmental leaders, putting aside their reluctance to get involved in foreign conflicts, engaged in an international war with Spain in 1898, largely due to sympathy for an independence movement in nearby Cuba. The United States took control of the Philippines and Puerto Rico, freed Cuba from Spanish control, and annexed Hawaii. In 1901, a treaty that gave the United States the right to build a canal across the Isthmus of Panama was signed. Our last heading, the Great War. In 1914, the European allies, the United Kingdom, France, and Russia, fought a war against the Central Powers, Germany and Austria-Hungary. Eventually, Italy, Japan, the Ottoman Empire, and other nations were drawn into World War I, the war to end all wars, quote unquote. The United States resisted involvement in the conflict until German attacks at sea precipitated a declaration of war in April of 1917. By the war's end in November 1918, some 16 million people were dead, including more than 50,000 Americans. On page 405, please note the literature selections that are there for the focus period, as well as the connections across time. Let's now turn to our study of Unit 4. Thank you.